So, what's trending? Bridging your Catholic faith with your everyday life. You're listening to Trending with Timmery on Relevant Radio.
Talk about the great news that came out this morning. Churches are considered essential places providing essential services, is what President Donald Trump came out saying today, and that the CDC will issue new guidelines effective immediately that our churches are essential. Now, I have to tell you, as a Californian, I have been whooping it up over here because I have to tell you, last week, I was just feeling like, are our churches ever going to open? We had some mayors saying that it may be years. It may not be until next year. We had our Governor Newsom here in California really pushing, it'll be in phase 3, but maybe even a later version of phase 3. The Department of Justice came out after Governor Newsom here in California earlier this week, and Governor Newsom still didn't budge. The Department of Justice said, hey, this is a religious persecution, and this is violating religious liberty. Now, what's interesting to me is that, of course, this is being made about President Trump rather than about freedom of religion. So I want you to bear with me, and let's talk about this for a moment from the perspective of freedom of religion, because I think that this is really important. We do need prayer in our culture. We need our freedoms as a fundamental part of living out the American lifestyle. We've stood by, since our foundation, the Declaration of Independence that emphasizes the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But here's the problem with some of what's happened during this quarantine. People are literally losing their livelihood. They are losing their liberty. And they cannot see a way forward in their pursuit of happiness. Now, even in wartime, people have not had as many liberties taken away as we are today. And so this is why it's so problematic, not just for churches, but other elements of life, to be able to pursue what is good, true, and beautiful in a culture, even when we are facing things such as the coronavirus. So here's the reality. This is why the churches are and can be considered essential services. And it goes back to our First Amendment right. In the First Amendment rights written into the Constitution, written into the amendments, focus on these two things: the freedom to assemble and the freedom to worship, which have been radically stripped from us. How is it that we can wait in line for an hour at Trader Joe's with quote-unquote social distancing, but we can't have 20 people in a cathedral that could hold thousands? I mean, it just hasn't made any sense. It's been a clear frontal attack on religion, on our churches. And many of the churches have very respectfully obeyed the commands of the governor and other officials. But then other churches are saying, no, this has to do about the well-being of an individual person, and this is a First Amendment right, and they've been willing to push back. And what's been fascinating is that as some churches have been fined small amounts, other churches haven't been at all, and it's just not holding up in court when the courts start to go into battle over whether or not this church should have to shut down. And it's interesting to me because we're even seeing law enforcement officers who are saying, no, we're not going to punish people for opening their businesses and opening their churches or attending a church service. Why? Because our Constitution, our First Amendment rights, the Declaration of Independence provides protections for the American people. And the protection is this: it's to protect the people from actually an oppressive government. The whole purpose of our three branches of government were really to focus on the checks and balances so that one branch of government couldn't bully its people in any way whatsoever and turn its back on the people. And so we as the people should be speaking up and advocating for our rights. But then bring this back to religion. One of the fundamental elements of the human person that the Catholic Church firmly upholds is the freedom of the individual. Now, this is a part of not just what the Catholic Church has upheld, but what the human person has been about since its beginning. God created us in an act of love with intellect and free will. And I know those are big words for a moment. We have to stop, though, and think, what does it mean to be made with intellect and free will? It means that I can come to know something and I can freely choose it. And so what's fundamental to being a person is being able to chase after what is good, what is true, and what is beautiful. But that also means our ability to fail at times as well, to turn away from what is good, to turn away from what is true, and turn away from what is beautiful and will bring ultimate happiness for our lives. And so this is a really good moment for us to praise the Lord that the churches are being recognized as essential places that provide essential services, and that no government should be able to overrule our freedom to worship in this great country. So praise the Lord. I hope that as kind of the battle continues and people are maybe frustrated over maybe concerns over safety and so forth, that they see that the church is trying to follow the rules, keep people safe. Sure, wear the gloves for distributing communion. Wear the masks if we have to, do what we need to do, socially distance, have 30% capacity or whatever is necessary. The churches are willing to do that. But we shouldn't be allowing restaurants and liquor stores and grocery stores to have a higher capacity than a church can. And that's when it's problematic. So here's the other thing that I want to talk about. And if you're just joining us, you're listening to Trending with Timmery, and I'm really excited in just a bit because we're going to be talking about atheism. And I have to tell you, please don't change the channel, because I think sometimes if you're like me, when I hear the word atheism brought up, I kind of get a little nervous because I think of grand apologetic debate points that are great and so intelligent, but that really scare me away and think, man, I don't know if I can hold that in a conversation necessarily. And listen, I want you to understand, I get it. I have a master's degree in biblical theology. I have tons of education in philosophy. And even then, I can be kind of scared away from some of these debates surrounding atheism. So we're going to be breaking this down, and actually we'll be hearing from Sister Aletheia Nobel about her story after spending 10 years as an atheist, and very practical and simple tips for how you can talk to a friend or family member without having to be afraid or downcast about kind of your smarts going into the conversation or where it might go. So I want to encourage you, be ready for that conversation in just a minute here. One other thing I wanted to talk about, it's St. Rita's feast day. And as we've been talking about the pursuit of happiness, and yesterday we talked quite a bit about marriage and children with Helen Alvarez, we were talking about how it's almost become a point in the culture where marriage and babies are really only for the elite. And it's interesting because as we're facing kind of this coronavirus and the ability to provide and the topics about pursuit of happiness come up, I think of what's been happening in Italy. And there's been this really beautiful movement. As many women have struggled to get married because of the costs of marriage, they've been delaying having children. The monastery in Cascia, Italy, where is actually the monastery named after Saint Rita. Saint Rita is actually the patron saint of difficult marriages, impossible cases, infertility, and parenthood. And what's interesting to me about Saint Rita is that people since the 1950s have been going to this monastery and donating their wedding dresses in Thanksgiving or as an offering to pray for their difficult marriages. But what's come out of this monastery in the meantime has been a nun by the name of Sister Maria Laura, who joined the convent when she was 28 years old. But that was after having been a seamstress and a designer in Tuscany. Now, you know what she does? All these wedding dresses, hundreds upon hundreds of them that people have been donating to the convent there, she has actually been altering and helping to fit women who would otherwise not necessarily be able to get married if they didn't have the assistance of the community to marry. And so I think it's really incredible that today, on the feast day of St. Rita, who like St. Jude is known for hopeless cases, we're seeing yet again this bounce back and this freedom of religion that is being re-implemented, and kind of we're being reminded of its importance in the culture. That when we kind of suppress a culture from its freedom to worship, from its freedom to provide for people, people begin to lose hope. Yet I want to encourage you to pray to St. Rita. Maybe you've been experiencing infertility. Maybe you desperately want to get married and you're having a hard time meeting that person. Maybe one of your adult children or teenagers has left the faith. They suddenly say they're atheist or agnostic or quote unquote spiritual but not religious. We'll be talking about that a little bit later on as well. I want you to pray to St. Rita and think of her incredible intercession and even of just the great miracle of today and even the story of Sister Maria Laura, who has been helping to custom fit wedding dresses for women who otherwise wouldn't have a wedding dress. Joining me, as I mentioned today here on Trending with Timmerie, is Sister Aletheia Nobel. She is joining me to share with us a little bit about her story after living as an atheist for 10 years. Now, she's the author of The Prodigal You Love, and you may have heard it back in 2019, Memento Mori, which there's a journal, a book, and all kinds of great reflections to remember our death. That's what the phrase reminds us of. Sister, it's a joy to have you on. I'm a great fan of your work.
Thanks so much for inviting me on, Timmerie.
I want to talk about atheism with you. So for 10 years, you lived as an atheist. Did this start in high school? When did it begin for you?
Yeah, so I was 14 when I chose to become an atheist, and the main reason was the problem of suffering. So I struggled with the problem of suffering from a young age. I still struggle with it. I think a lot of people struggle with the problem of suffering, and especially now. But that was the main reason why I decided I couldn't fathom a God who allowed suffering, and I assumed that if God existed and he allowed suffering, then he couldn't be a loving God. And so I just decided that whether he existed or not, he was either a cruel God who allowed suffering or he didn't exist. And I mean, actually, this is a good intuition. I decided God must not be cruel, so he must not exist. And so from that time on, I was an atheist.
Fascinating. Now, so that started when you were really young. And what's interesting to me is a lot of people who tend to end up becoming an atheist, it tends to happen right around that 13, 14-year-old range. Why do you think that is? And how can you kind of provide insight for maybe parents who are experiencing this right now with their own middle school, high school age kids?
Yeah, and I think it's getting younger and younger. Like 9-year-olds are saying that they start to doubt whether they believe in God on a regular basis, and I think there's so much going on there. And a lot of parents often ask me questions about what my home life was like, and then they're very disturbed when they hear that actually my family was very faithful Catholics. They were very active. My parents in many ways did everything right, not everything, but most parents don't. And so really, I think the main thing that I say to parents is to nourish in your child a curiosity for the faith. And that's really important at the same time that you do that, to allow them to voice their doubts, to not be shocked by their doubts, to not make them feel bad for doubting, and to really not to be scared of their doubts. Because I think that's another thing, even as atheists grow up and their families are interacting with them, I think there's a lot of fear in those interactions, a fear of not being able to respond to the person or not knowing what to say to the person's doubts. And I think when we're comfortable with our own doubts and we realize that we have our own doubts and we bring those to God regularly, I think that helps us to be in communion with our children when they're doubting, and then with older atheists in our lives.
That's Sister Aletheia. She's a daughter of St. Paul and also the author of The Prodigal You Love. We'll be sure to link to that on the show page at relevantradio.com/trending. Sister Aletheia, I have a question. So I'm kind of thinking about what you're saying, and what I see very common, and this is one of the problems I have, is that often we're taught Catholic doctrine, and unfortunately, sometimes it's taught as this is what it is, but we don't tell you why. For example, contraception is wrong, but we're not going to tell you why. There's a problem with abortion, but we're not going to say why. There's a problem with same-sex marriage, but we don't go into why. We just say this is. Now, the law in and of itself is great, but if we don't understand the details, if we don't understand the reason, we're not going to stand with it. In fact, we might automatically kind of just oppose it. Like, for example, even saying things like, hey, don't have sex outside of marriage. Just like a petulant child, you tell the child not to do something and they're going to do it. And so I think when we don't give that reason, it causes a problem. So when you said, encourage young people to nourish curiosity, to voice their doubt, it provides the opportunity to ask why. And I think sometimes we're afraid of that because we don't really feel equipped to give an answer. And so how could we apply this to friends and family members, let's say, with practical tips to give that reason why, or just better direct the conversation when they come up?
Yeah, in my book, I didn't focus a lot on apologetics, which is the reason why we believe. And I think that's very valid. Like Catholic Answers, it provides that for people a lot. There are a lot of books about apologetics. Peter Kraft has some books, Trent Horn. But, my book has a little bit of a different focus because I think a lot of people out there are not they're never going to feel comfortable arguing about the faith. And to me, that's okay. It's okay to not always feel totally comfortable with being able to articulate why you believe what you believe. I think it's important to read the catechism. I think it's important to try to learn more and try to grow in knowledge about the faith. But I think if that's all evangelization kind of boils down to in our minds, then we're going to be afraid of it because some people are better at that than others naturally. But we're all meant to be evangelizers. So how can we be called to evangelize even in moments where I don't know the answer to someone's question? And I think that's what, if we're ready for that, then we're ready for anything. Then in the meantime, we can beef up our knowledge on certain topics, or when someone asks us a question that we don't know, we can say, I'm going to have to look into that. But to not be afraid of those moments, because our faith is not about what we know as much as it's about who we know. We know God, and we have a relationship with God. And Jesus tells us in Luke, the Holy Spirit will teach you at the moment what you should say. And so in my book, I have a whole chapter about listening to the Holy Spirit because I think that's really important in our relationships with our loved ones, to pause in the moment, to not be scared when you're kind of attacked with a question and you think, oh my goodness, I don't know the answer to this. I am failing here. I'm going to fail this person, and they're not going to learn about Jesus from me. They can learn about Jesus even in the moment where in humility you say, I'm not quite sure what the answer to that question is. Why is it important to you? And I think that's really important too, is to get behind the objections that people have to why it's important to them. Because a lot of times it comes from experiences that they've had, interactions that they've had. And so a lot of times our evangelization is really about growing in relationship to the person, not having an argument with them.
That's Sister Aletheia, the author of The Prodigal You Love. We're talking about atheism. And what you're saying really stands out to me because, honestly, whether it's abortion, whether it's gay rights, whether it's religion, politics, I think the best point of reference to start a conversation is to listen to where the other person is at. Because honestly, just like a good therapist knows, most of their job is listening. And even in the kind of counseling room with women who are in crisis pregnancy, my job is not to tell her, you need to have this baby and this is the best thing for you. No, my job in those moments, whether in the counseling room or in front of the abortion clinic, or even just when someone comes up with a difficult question, is to see, where are they going with their thought? What's going wrong? And how can I ask them to help them work it out for themselves to be equipped? Because a lot of the time it's a mind game. There's something in the way, like you said, from past experiences or whatever it might be. And so often, and Trent Horn from Catholic Answers says this a lot, is he actually encourages people, ask good questions. This is what we want to make sure we do, that we're asking the right questions. It's not about always giving the right answers.
Absolutely. And I think women have a beautiful ability, and John Paul II and St. Edith Stein talk about this. We have a beautiful ability to receive the person in front of us. And so in that way, we can teach about evangelization and help people to understand evangelization in a slightly different way than men can. Both are very important, and both are very valid. But I think for us, we know more instinctively how to receive the person in front of us as they are. And that is really, really key in evangelization. Because if people don't feel accepted and loved by us, if they feel just kind of their ideas are just being kind of batted back at them, and if it's a kind of a war of the egos, or if we're just trying to be right, then even if we're making good arguments, we can actually damage that person's journey towards God. It's really, the question is, Holy Spirit, what do you want me to do in this situation for this person? How do you want me to show you to them? And sometimes it's not in making the argument, even if you know it. Sometimes it's just in asking the questions because they're not ready for that argument yet.
You know what's interesting is there is one argument that Brandon Voigt often gives. He works a lot with young Catholic minds who come from an atheist perspective, or who came from an atheist perspective, and he debates a lot with atheists. And he talks about how you have to ask good questions. And one of the things he comments on is that you have to ask the question, well, what would it take? What would be the good argument? And I find in my own experience, when I ask that question, well, what would it take for you to have your baby? Or what would it take for you to believe in God? People are often looking for some sort of divine revelation. And so this makes me ask you the question, what brought you away from atheism into Catholicism? Was it a great argument, or was it some person or thing that brought you along the way?
You know, for me, I had some internal intellectual struggles that I struggled with kind of on my own. I didn't really argue with anyone about them because I wasn't really ready, but I was asking myself, does the soul exist? And if the soul exists, does God exist? So those are things that I was struggling with intellectually. But then when I think back on my journey, and I did have a moment where I suddenly believed in God, but there was intellectual development over that time, and there was also heart development. My heart was being informed, and the Christians who informed my heart were the Christians who they didn't argue with me, but they showed me God. They showed me God through their love for me and through their acceptance for me. And it was just in little comments that they would make sometimes to kind of challenge me, that really moved my heart to be open to God's revelation to me in that moment when I knew that He existed and that He loved me and that He had a plan for my life.
And I think that that's a really important point for each and every single one of us to remember, that it wasn't just the intellectual argument that was something that you were working out, but it was that people loved you and brought the truth of Christ to you, and that helped to work on your heart, to soften your heart toward our Lord Jesus Christ. That is Sister Aletheia Nobel. She's the author of The Prodigal You Love and Memento Mori. You can learn more about her work at relevantradio.com/trending, where we'll be sharing all the information about her great books. We'll be right back here on Trending with Timmery.
Hi, this is Father Rocky. Today is May 22nd. In just 9 days, we're going to celebrate Pentecost. When I was chaplain at Northridge Prep, I was giving a chapel talk to 6th grade boys in the month of May, and I asked them, hey, have any of you ever received a miracle or a favor from the Blessed Mother? Well, immediately 4 hands shot right up in the air. The other boys looked at them like, how come you got a miracle and I didn't? So I said, look, never mind if you haven't received a miracle or favor from the Blessed Mother. It's because you haven't needed one yet. The boys with their hands in the air smiled and nodded in agreement. So I ask you, have you ever received a miracle or a favor from the Blessed Mother? I know I have. But out of modesty, I'm just going to keep that to myself for now. The point is, Mary is our mother in heaven. She is the queen of angels and saints, and she can and she does intervene powerfully in human history and in your own history if you ask her and you need her help.
We're talking about what you're thinking about. You're listening to Trending with Timmery on Relevant Radio and the Relevant Radio app.
The Relevant Radio studio line is sponsored by Catholic Order of Foresters. Employment opportunities to become an agent or information about their flexible premium life insurance plans are available at relevantradio.com/forester. So earlier we were talking about atheism. Now, I want to talk now a little bit about spirituality and this claim, which kind of just like makes my head spin a little bit, of I'm spiritual, not religious. What does that even mean? We'll be touching on that in just a second. Also, coming up, we'll be talking about just some of these things that maybe we need to reevaluate. God willing, this quarantine is coming to an end for most of us. We can move on with our life, but let's be real. With 2 months of being stuck at home, shouldn't something have changed in our lives after 2 months of being separated from the sacraments? I hope that we have shaken ourselves up and made some changes. And so the question is, essentially in this area, now that it's ending, have we taken stock of where we are at? And have we really looked at what is and is not benefiting us in our day-to-day life? Also, we'll talk about things that we need to stop feeling bad about. First, so let's talk about this I'm spiritual, not religious. So Karen, my producer, sent me a couple weeks ago this photo that was just, oh my goodness, I think a great example of what people mean when they say I'm spiritual, not religious. But then also it's one of those moments where like swipe for the real me, swipe for me without makeup, like swipe for the honest, like truth of what's going on in the background. So here's the photo. The first photo essentially shows spirituality as this free bird just floating along. And then it shows another bird representing religion that's a bird in a cage. Then if you were to do that hypothetical swipe, what you'd see is that the bird without a house is what the prey is for the demons. And I thought that this was really fascinating because here's what's kind of the great example of this. We have a blessed Bartolo Longo, who lived in the 19th and 20th century, and he lived in Italy. Now, what's interesting to me about his story is that he grew up Catholic, but like Sister Aletheia earlier, and like many others, you kind of hit those teenage years and you're starting to ask questions. You're starting to kind of live out that free will in a little bit more free of a way than you had before. And you start to ask these questions, and one of the questions he started to ask eventually led him to living that spiritual, not religious type of lifestyle. But what ended up happening is he started doing things such as seances and eventually ended up becoming a satanic priest. But what he realized is that his life was really empty. He was actually unhappy. He started experiencing nightmares, extreme nervousness, body ailments, depression, and even hallucinations. And then he started to develop a relationship with a Dominican priest who helped bring him out of this experience. And Blessed Bartolo Longo ended up becoming a third order Dominican. And I look at his story, and you may be going, wait, hold on a second. You went from spiritual, not religious, to full-on Satanist. Okay, I did go there. And I'm forgetting who is Tom Brady married to? Can someone tell me who Tom Brady is married to? I'm forgetting his wife's name right now. Giselle. There we go. Okay, so he's married to Giselle. Now, if you don't know this, but Tom Brady's Catholic. He's involved in his church there in, I think, Santa Monica, California. And at the same time, this incredibly talented athlete with all of these titles, all of these achievements, talks about how his wife refers to herself as a good witch. And we're talking about two Catholics here. And how she does things with him that are kind of in the spiritual, not religious realm, even though they're Catholic. And it creeps me out. And again, I'm not saying that all spiritual, not religious claims lead to Satanism, but here's what I am saying. There's something really wrong with a spiritual, not religious attitude when two things happen. One, when spiritual, not religious means me and Jesus. What we're really saying is that I'm too prideful to follow the church and the guidelines that our Lord Jesus Christ established. He came down in time and history and laid down his life for us. And we're not even willing to listen to what he had to say. Second claim of spiritual, not religious is, well, I just live out Buddhism or Hinduism. It's not a religion. It's just a practice. It's a way of life. And if you caught the episode last Friday with my dear friend Trisha, we talked about how yoga and Buddhism is actually problematic for Catholics because it's not just a way of life. If you didn't catch the episode, head over to relevantradio.com/trending because it is just an excellent episode that doesn't make you feel judged if you've done yoga and doesn't make you feel like you've done something wrong if you didn't get exactly what Buddhism is. Because the reality is that I think Buddhism and yoga provide great elements for a means of stretching and exercise and even this desire for self-betterment and virtue. But we're getting something wrong. And that's what this episode touches on. But here's the deal. If we go back to that original picture of looking at the kind of churched versus unchurched people, the church people have two things. They have direction and they have a definition for what is and what is not. You see, when we're spiritual, not religious, anything goes. And that's why it is logical for the conclusion to be very high likelihood that Satanism and the demonic will enter in. Hence Giselle. Hence 200 years ago now, basically, Blessed Bartolo Longo, where we start to say we're spiritual, not religious, and we start to try to come out of the quote-unquote cage of religion. We're just creating more ambiguity and confusion for ourselves. Again, churched people have a direction. They have a definition. And what's that definition and direction for? It's for love and it's for truth. And I keep thinking of Sister Aletheia Nobel's testimony earlier. She talked about how in being an atheist, she was working out these intellectual arguments in her head. She was seeking out truth. But at the same time, her heart was being moved by people who loved her and by people who were willing to reach out to her and help show her the way, to help show her truth. And so when we're talking about maybe having these conversations with people who are quote unquote spiritual, not religious, or who are atheists, I think it's important to take 3 tips, and I pull these from Brandon Vogt, who uses this when he talks about atheism in particular, but he works a lot with young people who identify as atheists, specifically millennials. And he emphasizes the importance of respecting their intelligence, respect the fact that they probably do have some good intellectual arguments, and they probably have thought about this. But also, as Jen Fulwiler talks about, she'll also talk about how we can't even make comments and say to people, you know what, you're actually too smart to be an atheist. And I don't think there's anything offensive about that, but here's the deal. There's often a lot more common ground we have with the other individual than they or I realize necessarily. So that leads to the second tip that Brandon Vogt gives. He says, find common ground. And I think that this is something, again, whether you're talking about abortion, gender, politics, religion, the reality is that many of us do have things in common. And so start with that. And I think that begins with that third tip we talked about earlier of you have to start to ask good questions. It's the Socratic method. And this is where we just have to ask questions that start with understanding, where are you coming from? Because if we can start with the premise of understanding where the other person is coming from, it makes the conversation more personal. because we see there's a person in front of us. And so whether they're dabbling in witchcraft, atheism, Hinduism, Buddhism, yoga, whatever it might be, we might get just a little bit more of a glimpse as to why they have a problem with religion. And I think that this is a key into helping us feel a little more comfortable and confident in those conversations. And don't get me wrong, all the time I have to be willing to say, I don't know the answer to that. That's a really good question. Here's what I do know, but I should actually give you more information later on. And, it's funny because I was put on the spot earlier this week. Someone asked me a question. I was so out of the blue. I was kind of trying to give an answer, and I was surprised by the question. And then later on, I was like, why didn't I just say, I don't know? I'll let you know later on. Because that's way simpler and provides a lot less guilt than kind of trying to be afraid of the argument or avoid the question. Be honest. And so I think the bottom line is this actually takes humility when we're in a conversation with another person. But if we're willing to have that personal conversation, then humility is necessary because it's about winning a person, not an argument. And I think that is often the hardest point. We want to win the argument. We want to sound smart. We want to be winners. We want to get ahead. We want to be competitive. But that's not what life is about. And so I think that these are some of the keys for helping us get over our fears surrounding atheism, spiritual, not religious, or whatever debate you or I might find ourselves in. We'll be right back here on Trending with Timmerie. We'll be talking about some tips for things that we need to just not worry about anymore, and also how we can take stock of our lives and get rid of some of those things that just don't need to be there anymore. We'll be right back.
So, what's trending? Bridging your Catholic faith with your everyday life. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie on Relevant Radio and the Relevant Radio app.
If you want to see that picture that I was talking about earlier about being spiritual, not religious, you can head over to my social media. You can find me at Timmerie. Just head over to relevantradio.com/trending, and you can click your favorite social media links from there to stay connected and also learn what we're going to be talking about each week on the show and every day here on Trending at 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. It's great to be with you on your drive. Hopefully you're back on the road and back to normal life before this awesome 3-day weekend. So here is a post that I was reading about the other day, and it was titled Things to Stop Feeling Bad About. Now, I think that this is geared a little more so to women, but I think that it's relevant to all of us. And here are some of the things that it touches on. For example, it says, stop feeling bad about saying no. Now, this is one that I know women eat themselves alive over. And in fact, just a couple weeks ago, Jim O'Day from Integrity Restored and I were talking about how a lot of specifically young women don't feel comfortable saying no to sexting, requests for various nude images. And so they go along with it because they feel bad. But this is also a really bad habit in the dating culture for women. When someone asks them out, they're really not interested. And so unfortunately, we ladies can be a little guilty of egging guys on because we feel bad to turn them down. But in reality, it's the nicest thing we could do because they can move on and they can see that someone can respectfully turn them down without making them feel like crap for egging them on for a really long time. And then you suddenly treat them like a stalker. I'm sorry, do you know anyone who's done this? They're like, oh, he's really sweet, but, I'm hanging out with them. And then all of a sudden, you're like, this guy's a stalker. And I'm like, no, he's not. You've been egging him on for months, maybe even for years. It's your fault. Why? Because you weren't willing to say no. And again, this isn't just relevant to women because I think sometimes we feel like there's additional pressure being put on us at work. I see it a lot having worked in the nonprofit world, but also in the for-profit world where We need to have boundaries. Sometimes a project is just a little too much. And it's okay to say, hey, I have X, Y, and Z going on. If I'm going to do this, what do you want me to cut out and put in its place? Because sometimes people don't recognize what our workflow is and the fact that we actually have a full plate. Or sometimes people don't realize what they're asking is going to require us to take time, important, precious time away from family, children, and other really important things in our life. And so things to stop feeling bad about saying no. In fact, you'll have more time if you say no a little more when you should. Now, another one they talked about, and this is one that I think is very relevant to today's conversation, is stop feeling bad for having an unpopular opinion. This is called political correctness, and as someone once told me, PC actually stands for pure crap. Let's stop just kind of following along with the crap everyone else essentially wants to promote. And we have to be willing to think for ourselves now and again, and even object when a whole group of friends thinks in a different way. You don't have to go and battle intellectually 6 people in front of you, whether it's friend, family, coworker, or whoever it is. But it's okay to say, actually, I disagree with that. There's a difference between saying, actually, I disagree, or the other day I was sitting quietly observing a conversation that was going down in front of me that was a heated political debate, and one individual kept looking at the other saying, well, your arguments are just really bad, and I don't even think you know that person. And it was interesting to me because all I could think the whole time was, you're just insulting other people instead of actually allowing yourself to have an opinion that disagrees with the other. You feel like you just have to attack the person. And so unfortunately in our culture, because we feel bad about having an unpopular opinion, when we do speak up, we just attack the other person and insult them because we say, I think your facts are wrong, or I think you know nothing about that individual, instead of having good, wholesome conversations. Another thing to stop feeling bad about is to stop feeling bad about distancing yourself from toxic people. And I think that this comes back to the whole saying no thing. It's okay to not be buddy-buddy with people who just make you feel lousy. It's also okay to distance yourself from people who are harmful for you. And I find it interesting because we live in a culture where therapy has such a stigma to it, but at the same time, a lot of people need a therapist to help them know it's okay to say no, or it's okay to get some space from people that are unhealthy for us, or it's okay to speak up and speak your mind respectfully. And so, a little bit of free advice. I'm not a therapist, but think about it. This is often what therapists are doing. They are equipping you to stand on your own 2 feet, to be your own best advocate, to live a happy life. Now, this is one of the other fun ones that I actually wanted to talk about, is it says, stop feeling bad about the number on a scale. Now, I have to tell you, everyone's in a different journey in terms of the number on the scale. Maybe it's not the freshman 15, but the coronavirus 15 that you've been experiencing recently. It's real. I'm hearing from many people that this has been a real thing. No gyms, food. If you haven't partaken in the official quarantine activity yet, it is time to start baking bread. It's not too late. You should really try it because that's what everyone is doing. And I'm feeling a little left out because I still haven't made bread yet. I think I only maybe made some cookies, and that wasn't until Lent was over. So go make some bread, maybe send me a photo of it. I'll be like mouth-watering hungry after you send me the photo. But back to the number on the scale. I can tell you, for me personally, I years ago threw out my scale. I don't weigh myself. I discover what I weigh every time I go to the doctor's office, and I say, interesting. And I'll never forget, years ago, someone gave me this tip. They said, if your clothes don't feel uncomfortable, that's a great sign that you need to change something. If you're feeling tired, lethargic, having a hard time sleeping, those are signs that you need to change something. The reality is that most of us spend so much time being obsessed over a number on a scale that it gets in the way of us just being content and happy with ourselves. I think the same thing is true with a mirror or our obsession with taking selfies. Sometimes we're constantly criticizing and evaluating our own lives that we lose sight of the fact that there's actually something okay with me, and the toxic problem is how I keep obsessing over the scale or on the camera angle. Now, have you ever noticed that I was looking at like the psychology of camera angles, and girls tend to take like the camera angle from like higher up and sideways because it makes them look skinnier apparently, but like guys tend to like take the camera angle from like under them because it makes their face like look bigger and more prominent so that they look like a little more dominating. I thought this was really interesting, so now I really pay attention to when someone takes a selfie, what angle they take the selfie from. Enjoy. You're gonna go through Instagram and social media stalk people now, but actually I'm really going to encourage you, now is not the time to do that, because we're going to talk about things now in light of the things we need to stop feeling bad about. What do we need to take stock of? The quarantine is coming to an end, and we have precious moments to reevaluate our lives. You're listening to Trending with Timmery. It's been great to be with you. I hope you have an awesome holiday weekend coming up here, celebrating Memorial Day. Partially celebrating freedom here, right? Let's celebrate that freedom. Get to church this weekend because our church doors should be open. Now, here's the thing. What is not benefiting you? What do you need to take stock of in your life? How can you say, where am I and what do I need to change? Maybe it's some bad habits that you've picked up during the quarantine. Or more realistically, maybe it's things that were going on prior to the quarantine that you're realizing just wasn't necessary, wasn't good for your body and your soul. Now, I'll pose this as one example, and this is actually why we thought of this topic. I was talking the other day to my producer when we were discussing the yoga episode that we did here on Trending, which actually is airing again on Monday on Memorial Day. So if you missed it, don't miss the show this Monday. We're talking about yoga and Buddhism. But sometimes we think things are good for us, they're benefiting us, but underlying that, it's something that's actually not that great for us. Maybe it's the amount of TV you've been watching or watch on a day-to-day basis. In fact, maybe you're realizing, I don't really know that much about my faith. I'm feeling like I was a Sunday-only Catholic, and when I haven't had the church for these last couple months, I'm realizing I really do want to know more. And so maybe it's 15 minutes a day that you're going to start spending reading. It just starts with taking a couple minutes to build up that reading habit yet again. So I hope you guys have a happy Memorial Day weekend. Enjoy the sun, but take stock of maybe just one or two things that you can change moving forward in your life.